Episode 15 of the WildFed Podcast, Black Bears and Wild Rice with Arthur Haines, is brought to you by Surthrival. Surthrival is a purveyor of dynamic, highly regenerative, bioavailable supplements and superfoods that fuel your adventures and help you recover from long days in the field. Surthrival's premier lines of colostrum, elk antler velvet, CBD, pine pollen, and medicinal mushrooms offer improved performance, robust health, sustained endurance, and advanced recovery. Level up your body and mind with the most powerful regenerative food substances in the natural world. Surthrival enables ordinary people to do extraordinary things. Check out the lineup at surthrival.com. For those of you that ordered Season 1 of the WildFed TV show, you received Episode 5 yesterday. That episode, I Do Love Seafood, follows my work on a commercial lobster and halibut fishing boat, harvesting food for my upcoming wedding. I also go out on the tidal ledges, learning to harvest seaweeds, and then come home to share a meal with my friends and my newlywed wife at our wedding. You'll see how we make a delicious salad using the seaweed alaria, and then get an intimate behind-the-scenes look as Avani and I celebrate our union and our guests share a meal of lobsters and other wild meat and fish I've harvested throughout the year. If you aren't currently subscribed to the show, go over to wild-fed.com to purchase Season 1. 5 episodes are available to watch today, and you'll receive a new episode each Monday until all 8 episodes have been released. I'm Daniel Vitalis, and you're listening to the WildFed Podcast, a show about reconnecting with nature through hunting, fishing, foraging, and food. WildFed. Food is all around you. Today's show is with Arthur Haines, and this one's a doozy. We start off making the case for wild foods. How do they stack up nutritionally against the plants and animals we raise for food, and what does the science tell us? Then we transition into a conversation about the harvest of wild rice with all of its unexpectedly sensitive politics. We attempt to thread the needle of this surprisingly delicate topic with care before transitioning to the topic of black bear hunting with hounds. On its face, that hunt is a more overtly controversial topic than wild ricing, yet one that he and I tackle pretty confidently. And that's because Arthur and I initially approached hound hunting with some trepidation. But the actual experience has made us converts, and the reasons become obvious as we describe the incredible food properties of the black bear and make the case for why hunting with dogs makes so much sense. Not just from the ancestral point of view, but also as hunters here in the forests of the Northeast. Interviews with Arthur are always eye-opening, but I think this is a particularly good one. Next week, we'll be talking with Molly Lutkovich, research professor at UMass Boston and director of their Large Pelagics Research Center. She specializes in bluefin tuna, and she has an incredible story about how the alarmist claims about the Atlantic bluefin stocks may be overblown, and how her funding has been cut and her reputation smeared for sharing the scientific data that demonstrates that Atlantic bluefin may not be imperiled at all, but may in fact be thriving, despite fishing pressures and their infamous demand in the sushi market. Until then, enjoy this captivating conversation with Arthur Haines, where we delve into the nuances of wild food nutrition, the surprisingly sensitive politics of wild ricing, and why there's still a place for hound hunting black bears even now in the modern era. Well, we're back. I've got our producer here, Grant Giuliano. How you doing today, Grant?
Good. How about you guys?
And of course, our illustrious guest, Arthur Haines, famed botanist. What else are you? Botanist, and what do you go by exactly? Now you've done a TED Talk. What do you go by?
I want to use Tony Stark's comment, billionaire, philanthropist, inventor, playboy.
Something like that. How'd that TED Talk go for you?
It went well.
I really got to talk to you about it. I talked to you before, but not really so much after.
Yeah, it was interesting to go there and see how this was set up. It was much more serious than I realized. And there were a couple of folks there. In particular, there were 2 women who were amazing public speakers. The one who went last was like one of the best public speakers I've ever listened to. And that to me is a huge compliment, because when you talk to me about public speaking, people will often hear me bring up your name, Daniel, because I'm like, this is a person that I consider to be an excellent public speaker. And this woman was just... It was like she had memorized 15 minutes word for word, except that it came out totally natural. No ums, no
authentic, like it was just fresh.
Amazing. And the woman who went immediately after me was also amazing. Not to say the other speakers were poor by any means. I only had one thing that I wish hadn't happened, and I was looking for the word interesting. And for some reason, I blanked on it.
Come on. It's like always the easiest words.
Yeah, and I'm getting ready to, I'm trying to say they had this particular study found an interesting result, and I just couldn't think of the adjective. And I pause. And I realized the pause has now gone on. It went on for so long that I was like, excuse me, folks. And then I started again. And fortunately, they kind of half-edited it out.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I mean, it was probably only a few seconds max, but it was like, oh God, where is it?
You're like, I got 7,000 binomial Latin names in my head, but I can't think of it interesting.
It was funny, but other than that, it went pretty well. I was the first one, which was actually nice.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Cold audience.
They just set me up. I kind of wanted to go first because so many of the topics were really focused on social justice, workplace ethics, fear, depression, and cybersecurity, and really very much industrial topics. Yeah. And mine was the departure. Sarah and I joked that I was the token Earth topic.
And your theme again, for people who haven't seen it, we'll put links to the actual.
Oh, cool. Talk, yeah, it was just discussing our conservation paradigm and how when we use a hands-off conservation approach, we alienate the public from the resources we are hoping to protect, which ultimately doesn't protect them. And the second part of that is the always assumption that you don't have to eat wild food. You can eat the stuff in the supermarket. There's the always assumption is that those foods are equivalent. And we know for a fact they're not. I mean, how many studies need to come out demonstrating that there's a difference? And so I went through some of the really good examples of how different, I used plants, but how different wild plants are from cultivated plants. And it was well received, which is cool.
It's a kind of a departure from our topic today, so I'll just let people know what we're going to be talking about, which is episode 6 of WildFed, where we go wild ricing, and we had our bear hunts for 2018. So we'll circle back to that in a second. But while we're on this topic, I think it's so valuable. So I'm going to try to bring it around here. You and I have done a lot of things together since that episode was filmed, and so I feel like this accumulation of a lot of things I'd like to talk about. We took the Maine Guides course, and that was, I think, 4 days of instruction. Right. And then we did another block, a wilderness first aid block, which you and I had trained at that level in the past, but was a nice refresher to do. And we were at that fantastic school in New Hampshire, Solo. Great wilderness outdoor school. But I really felt the difference of where we were at compared to where the other students were at with regard to how we interact with the landscape. Because the majority of the people in the wilderness first aid class were people dedicated to a life in the outdoors, but who relate to it in such a radically different way. So kind of coming back to what you were just talking about with a conservation paradigm, I feel like whether any of those people could articulate the conservation paradigm or not, they were products, I guess, of that paradigm, that hands-off paradigm, or what, the leave no trace paradigm of interacting with the wilderness. So
can I just say that the leave no trace paradigm is a leave no trace in this part of the world? Because what you're doing to have all those refined fuels made and the synthetic clothing is you're leaving a massive trace elsewhere.
That's what's so weird about it to me. It's like, take your garbage out of there and then put it in a landfill. It's like, I do want them to do that,
of course.
But it's ironic that I sometimes just wonder, I guess this is just, I come back to this all the time because I want to believe that everybody has the same ability to cognitive ability, but some people don't really like to think multiple steps ahead of something. So it just seems like it makes sense. Carry all your garbage out. But to me, the obvious thing is like to bring it where it goes in a hole in the earth. Therefore, you are not leaving no trace, right? And so, like you said, all the equipment needed to leave no trace. And yet, if we were to kind of do the things that we like to do in the woods with those folks, they might look at us like we would look at them if they were leaving candy wrappers everywhere, right? They'd be like, "Oh my God, you're extracting things out of nature." So, that said, can you, without doing your whole TED Talk, can you kind of articulate a little bit more for people what the thrust of that talk was?
Yeah, the first half of it was talking about something that we can refer to by a couple of different names. I've been using reciprocal conservation lately because I believe that both parties are ultimately benefited depending on how it's done. And hands-on or that conservation through use is another phrase name for this, where we actually directly interact with the resources, but we do it in a very specific way, often a way that relates to traditional ecological knowledge and wisdom, what First Nations, what Indigenous people have pioneered and worked out. And I remember, Daniel, you talked about something regarding the nutrition and how many Indigenous people had worked out the kinks so that they could have these healthy intergenerational transmission of genes so that the next generation wasn't beginning to suffer higher rates of chronic disease than the generation before them. And I like to think of that in the same way of their harvesting, whether we're talking about the harvesting of animals, we're talking about the harvesting of plants, whatever it might be. They work this out to figure out how to do this in a sustainable manner. And reciprocal...
You're talking about extracting resources
That's
from the
right.
landscape
That's right.
specifically.
And there are a lot of really specific ways that we harvest plants in this way, but if we switch it to doing it the way it's done a lot today, it's no longer sustainable. It's no longer a reciprocal arrangement because it's benefiting one party far more than the other. And we often forget that hunting can be this too. It can be reciprocal, especially if we value those forests or whatever landscape we're talking about, where these animals are coming from so much, then in order to make sure that we can continue hunting, we are also focusing on protecting those landscapes, those ecosystems, those habitats where the animals are coming from. And I mean going more than just we pay a little tax in our hunting license, but actually being active in the public, actually maybe giving money, doing lectures to make people aware of how valuable these things are.
No, I would also, I would add to that, that there's always a need for volunteers who are willing to go out and do things on the landscape as well.
For sure. Yeah, that's a good addition. And the other thing is, if we really want to practice reciprocal conservation in a hunting activity, we also have to change slightly what we're targeting. Right?
I want to talk about that.
Yeah, and so I'll leave that.
No,
for when
I wanted. Okay, but yeah, let's come back to it in a second,
Okay.
because first I want to say, regarding your comments on the nutrition of wild foods versus domesticated foods. So just to bring everybody up to speed, the idea being that all of the foods in our supermarket have some counterpart in the wild that they were developed from either recently or in some, back into antiquity. With plants, why don't you give a couple examples and then that come to mind, and then I will of differences of a wild to a domesticated nutritionally, and then I'll come back with my question after that.
Sure. I mean, and there's a lot of examples that we use, and I'll do kind of three examples. One is there's often just differences in vitamins, right? And if we take vitamin C, this water-soluble antioxidant, one of my favorite examples to use is, we've been told by our television commercials that oranges are very rich in vitamin C. But when we look at what we can actually acquire from the forests, from the seashore, from the marshes, there's a lot of different species of rose, we find that they're substantially higher. And the ranges, they're anywhere from 10 to almost 100 times more endowed with vitamin C than oranges are. It depends on the species that we target. For example, one of the species we can collect right here in Maine from our beaches is about 50 times.
You're talking about Rosa rugosa, our
Yeah,
beach roses
the beach
here.
rose, which is native to Asia but naturalized throughout
quite prolific.
the Maine coast. And remember, that's 50 times the antioxidant ability, because vitamin C is this really important part of our immune system function. And it does all kinds of other things as well that we don't need to get into right now. But I always like focusing on that one, because when you're wondering why cancer rates are where they are, We live in a context where we have a polluted landscape, and I'm not claiming Maine is terrible and we're all dying, but we do have mercury and cadmium raining out of the sky at times, and so on and so forth.
We also have environmentally pervasive things like PCBs, which seem to spread throughout the world pretty rapidly. Right.
And so it's not claiming that we shouldn't go outside anymore and that we're all scared to be doing it, but they exist, and now is a time we need protection from those things more than ever.
In other words, our need for antioxidants is not even. We're below baseline for humans.
Yes.
Let's say humans are 300,000 years old in our current form, and then we had a baseline consumption of antioxidants, which we're now well below, and then our need for antioxidants is actually way
higher.
above what baseline would be.
Exactly. Another example that I used in my TED Talk was a root vegetable. We talked about groundnut, which is a legume, a vine that has tubers, 23 times the calcium as potatoes.
Wow.
In fact, it was shown in tests to be higher than potatoes, sweet potatoes, and taro. It was higher than everything it was tested against. And people sometimes think, well, I'll just enrich the soils. But we know that's not what it was. There's something called the dilution effect, where the more we ask a plant to produce, the more the mineral nutrition gets diluted through the entire plant, including the parts that we collect for food.
And say that another way for me. I want to make sure I understand.
Yeah, it's like, try to imagine that if a plant only produced one fruit, and it would put a certain amount it had an ability to take up calcium from the soil and put it into that fruit. But if now we make a plant that can produce 50 of those fruits, it's still only pulling up so much calcium.
But diluting it throughout.
And it's diluting it. And that's an oversimplified example, but it's kind of how it works. And one of the best examples that we rarely think of as nutrition are the phytochemicals, the plant compounds, something that you and I have talked a lot about.
You are one of the people in the world who is talking about this.
And it's amazing the differences that we see between wild plants and cultivated plants. And there's a number of reasons, one of those being that when we tend plants, they don't have to defend themselves, right? We often put plants in the most hospitable locations, but we know that plants and fungi, for that matter, when they're grown in stressful conditions, they need to protect themselves from the sun, from the weather, from the wind, and all of these things.
Predators.
And that upregulates the production of these chemicals that turn out to be really beneficial to us.
I just want to jump in on that, because I just want to make sure I'm put that in the simplest way that I can.
Yeah.
That when a plant is stressed, the chemicals that it produces to, let's say, protect itself from UV radiation, those would be usually strongly antioxidant compounds.
Which we can use.
The chemicals that it might produce to protect itself from insects in the absence of insecticides are often medicinal compounds for us, right? Herbal medicines for us. So if we create very comfortable conditions in the same way that...
And we spray the plants?
So that they don't need to produce internally anything to defend themselves, then they become very phytochemically weak. Just like if we pamper a dog, a cat, or a baby human, they become weak in maybe social skills, financial skills, self-defense skills, survival skills, right? So similarly, when we do that to our plants, we suffer a lack of nutrition from
It's the exact same thing. And one of the most important ones that I presented on in the TED Talks is fruit size. Take blueberries. Most of the pigments, these anthocyanins that function as strong antioxidants in our body, are located in the skin. So when the fruit size increases, you have less skin per unit mass. Our little blueberries have lots of skin. Big blueberries, less skin. And so just by changing the fruit size, we find that antioxidant capacity for these fruits...
Consumption is going to go down.
That's right.
Your consumption.
You're eating the same mass.
If I'm going to eat 1 cup of blueberries...
That's right.
A cup is domesticated, 1 cup is uncultivated wild. I'll get far more skins in the wild cup. Therefore, I'll get far more antioxidant pigments.
As much as 8 times.
Wow, 8 times. Yeah, that's amazing. Not like 8%.
8 times.
And that was one thing, just because you mentioned... And actually, I want to say, as somebody who owns a nutritional supplement company, one of the things that I've learned is you get turned on to a new ingredient, and with so many things from nature, you can't possibly market to all of the things that it is known to do, capable of, or contain. So
Right.
you pick something. And I don't think people understand this because our understanding of the history of advertising is very weak here in the United States and in Canada and most of the developed world. But there is an apple industry. And an apple growers, I don't know what it would be, an association or something, but that's true with bananas, that's true with oranges. So they come up with advertising because it's like, imagine you're in the banana world, you got to compete with oranges, apples, and pears all the time. So you got to come up with a marketing scheme. So bananas are marketed for potassium. Right. Apples are marketed, I love that. Apple a day keeps the doctor away is not folk wisdom. That was a marketing thing that came up after the Prohibition to sell apples as a food. Vitamin C in oranges. I believe you've showed me research showing some commercial oranges containing 0 vitamin C.
It depends on how they're grown. There are some oranges that contain no vitamin C. That's correct.
So oranges are a great example because there's going to be a tremendous variation in how much vitamin C they have. But looking at fruits in general, they're at best they contain modest amounts of vitamin C.
Right.
But you were not. You were comparing apples and oranges because you were saying we were comparing roses to oranges in one case, right?
So what I always tried to do, because we were comparing different species, is to make sure we were comparing for the same unit mass of fruit, and that we were comparing fruit to fruit, tuber to tuber, leaf to leaf.
Which you just did.
Right.
I just want to make sure I add to it. You kind of touched on it with blueberries, that if we take a vegetable or a fruit and we compare it to its actual progenitor. But what would be another example besides blueberries we could do that with? I'm just trying to think of an example because I want people to understand this component of it too, that if we take a wild lettuce versus a cultivated lettuce, so that we have a 1-to-1, right? The same species, we see tremendously more nutrients.
We see much more provitamin A that can be transformed into the active form of vitamin A in our body. We see massive differences in the phytochemistry. I mean, no one would ever consider cultivated lettuce to be a mild analgesic, an antispasmodic, right. And all of these other things that wild lettuces can be used for as herbal medicine because it's gone.
Yeah, because it worked right out of it. So that brings me, actually, I want to ask you the equivalent questions about animals because it's much, as I understand it, and I've been out of, this hasn't been where my mind has been for a few years, nor my research, but it seems to me that it's a much clearer case with plants. That it's a much
stronger. Yeah, for sure.
Stronger case, you're saying.
Right.
Yeah. So in other words, when we're looking at it's a lot more significant if we compare wild blueberries to cultivated blueberries. But how is it if we compare deer meat to, let's say, beef meat? A lot of times there we have obvious ethical things that come up.
Right.
We have landscape issues that emerge very clearly, and greenhouse gas issues that emerge. But
if we can move that aside and just talk about the nutrition, it comes back to how the animals are raised. For example, we find that if we have cows that are grazed on pasture, and remember their biological norm is eating grass and tender forbs, not grain. So long as we don't feed them grain, to give an example, we have an omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratio, these essential fatty acids that our bodies can't manufacture, of 2-to-1, which is really good because we're actually looking for something.
2 parts omega-6, 1 part omega-3.
1 part omega-3, that's right. Because we'd like to be in that 1-to-1 to 3-to-1 range, so that we're not heading toward pro-inflammatory immune system dysfunction trends when we get really skewed results and step away from our historical norms. So, but if we graze those same cows, quote, graze them on, say, a really high corn diet where we're feeding them a lot of grain, that 2-to-1 goes to 5-to-1. And we start seeing differences. Now we're starting to step outside of that really ideal range that we want to be at. We also know that take a broiler chicken with those massive breast meat, right, can compare to something like a ruffed grouse, or for that matter, to the its wild progenitor that was found in the forests of Asia, you end up seeing a much higher proportion of lean meat to, say, skin and organs and things like that contain a completely different suite of nutrients.
Similar to what you were saying with the blueberry.
It's kind of like that. So you end up eating so much more lean muscle meat compared to organ meats, compared to fats, compared to even, we don't often think of us eating cartilage and tendons, but we can do that through bone broths to make sure we're getting those collagen-rich broths in our diet.
And outside of just pure nutrition, I mean, those are really nice things to eat. I just like to eat.
If fair.
Please put a deer neck in the crock pot for me. I mean, I'd be real happy.
And so when we see humans eating a much higher proportion of lean, tender muscle meat that lacks a lot of those glycosaminoglycans and other compounds or other proteins that provide us with the glycine content to get to the amino acid involved there, there's some evidence showing that cancer rates go up because we have skewed glycine methionine ratios.
Methionine being more dominant in the lean muscle meat.
Yes.
Glycine being more dominant in the connective tissues.
Exactly. And so we often like to say that meat eaters have these high rates of cancer. But what we do know is a few things. One, we know that when you start eating animals that are cage-reared, being fed diets that are not appropriate, at least historically to that animal, we see essential fatty acid ratios getting distorted. That creates a problem. We see amino acid ratios getting distorted, and there's some evidence demonstrating that might be the case that's leading to higher cancer rates in omnivores. The point is it's not that eating meat causes cancer. We know that's not true. Hunter-gatherers were suffering a near zero incidence of cancer, and everywhere were omnivores, trending toward almost strict carnivores in some locations of the world, and we're not suffering cancer. The issue involved is the kind of meat we're eating.
Yeah, and the balance of those animal foods.
Exactly.
You know, when I first started deer hunting, I was so excited by eating deer steak because it's just so...
It's amazing.
It's so nice, right? Like when you cook the outside so that you get like a nice caramelization out there, and then when you cut into it and it's purple still and juices are so I'm
picturing this all in my
head. It's like mouth watering. So that's how I would want to eat all my deer. I would trim it out till it was really lean, until I just got sick of doing that. And now I'm getting much more interested in braising and roasting and eating more of that connective tissue. But I'm just picturing, like, let's say you've got a carcass hanging and, you know, you take the back straps out. You know, when you take them out and then you can see, you know, just a bit of the ribs to the transverse processes and then those spinal processes going down. And it's all woven together with a fabric of connective tissue that to the game butcher is scrap. But that is all the stuff that can be made into a liquidy gel that is so, when you eat braised meat, you have that satiation that comes from that. I mean, it's just like that stuff balances out that amino acid ratio so as to become cancer protective.
Yes, and that you'll see us when we're removing the meat off the legs and we bone out that thigh of the deer. I'll then cut just a little below the knee and a little above the knee to get all of that connective tissue rich area, and that's what we'll make bone broths out of.
And it's got to be too. I mean, I don't know how much this has been looked at, but I mean, you've got what's it, hyaluronic? How do you say that? Hyaluronic acid. You've got something like that. You've got synovial fluid in there. There's a lot going on inside those joints compared to let's say that I just give you the femur.
Bone.
Yeah, here's a femur versus here's a complex joint structure that's got the joint capsule intact, right? That's some good stuff.
And so often when we eat a particular thing, like say we eat a heart, well, heart concentrates all the things that heart needs to function. Yeah. You eat the heart, you're dosing up on nutrition that your heart needs. And the same is true of making these broths, because all of that is super beneficial for your joints.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So, wow. All right. Let's see how we're going to bring
There's the introduction
to. I want to talk about wild rice, and I guess a good place to start would be
off the top, I know you don't have all your notes with you, but we went wild ricing, and we've been doing this for some time here. You've been doing it for quite some time here in Maine, and introduced me to it.
You and I have been doing it for quite a few years now.
Yeah, and I've been really lucky to kind of get some tutelage from you, because now I really feel it took several years for it to feel like something that's like mine by practice now, but I do feel like that now.
Yes.
It took me a while to really assemble just to put the whole system together, because there's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah.
Because of all the forages we do, it's probably, I'd say it's even more than acorns. It's the most complicated wild food, yet it's probably the most rewarding wild food in the sense of what we get for food value from it, from the plant kingdom. Could you start by, or do you feel comfortable right now kind of comparing wild rice to, let's say, white rice, brown rice, or any of, and just for clarity's sake too, we're not talking about, wild rice is not the wild progenitor of the rices we eat now. These are different species, different
they belong
continents.
To different genera.
How far back do we go before we find them related to one another?
Oh, that's a good question, and I don't know that without looking into it.
Sorry, let me rephrase that.
Yeah.
What do you call if you've got a specific epithet at the bottom and at the top, what is that called there when you're breaking phylogeny down?
Yeah, you're talking about the taxonomic ranks.
Okay, so taxonomic
Kingdom,
rank.
phylum, class, order.
How far up that chain do we go before wild rice and...
They belong to the same family. They're both
That's
grasses.
what I'm getting at. Okay.
Right? So we're eating the fruit of a grass. Mm-hmm. Any grain that we eat isn't a seed, it's the fruit of a grass. It's a different thing. And they're related a little bit more closely than that, because we have subdivisions between family and genus even. And they're related within that sort of those ranks between those. But for the things that many people may have heard of, they belong to the same family but are different genera.
Okay.
There's 4 species of wild rice in the world. One's Asian. The other 3 are North American. One is endemic to Texas and incredibly rare, and the other 2 are widespread in North America.
Do you know of anyone harvesting in Texas, or is it not prolific enough?
It's grows in a very different way.
It's not a food typically.
No, not to my knowledge, because it's not widespread enough.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And so that one is, I'm assuming they're all Zizania.
That's right.
So in Texas, do you know what it is?
Zizania texana.
Okay. And then we've got Zizania palustris and aquatica.
Yeah, our northern and southern wild rice, respectively.
What is it in Asia? Do you know?
Latifolia.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So Zizania, the genus name, would be just a great name for a daughter. I just can't. I just keep thinking about, especially like a sassy daughter that's like, my name's Zizania. And wild rice is Oryza. What is it?
What's that? Oryza is the genus.
It is Oryza. Yeah.
Yep.
So okay, so just so people know, we're not saying wild rice as if it's the wild version of the rice that we eat,
right.
Although they are both grains.
But we are eating the same part from each plant. This grain, it's technically called a caryopsis. That's the name of the fruit. Yeah.
All right, great. I didn't know that. Is that true of any of the other grains?
All of them, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Grain
caryopsis.
Grain is a lay word for caryopsis.
Okay, cool.
Yep.
How do those stack up against each other when we start to compare
They're
them?
not even close.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't have the numbers in my head, but if you look at B-complex vitamins, wild rice is far above cultivated rice in every single, all of the ones like B1, B2, B3, that people would be thinking about, thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, to give the other names for those. It's higher in protein content. Really interestingly, most grains are really skewed toward omega-6 fatty acids. And that's one of the reasons why we have a very high grain diet like we do here in the United States. You see people with so much inflammation and such poor immune system function because they're eating wheat or corn at every meal in some form. And up goes their omega-6 ingestion. Wild rice is different. It's omega-6 to omega-3 content is like 2 to 1.
Is it really?
Yeah, it's really.
So it's already in the ideal range.
It's it's 99% or excuse me, I should say it's only about 1% lipids.
Right.
To begin with. It's very low, but the lipids that it has are in that ideal range.
Okay, so if I could if I could just make sure I understood that. Its lipid content is so low that it's not a significant contributor to dietary lipids. However, other grains that we're eating do contribute significantly to our dietary lipids. And they're contributed
to a
omega-6
skewed ratio.
Yeah, overabundance of omega-6.
Yep.
How did you get turned on to wild rice as a food? Could you talk us through, I sort of know a little bit of the story, but tell us a little bit about that journey for you from being a botanist who's aware that the plant exists to being somebody who's harvesting it and using it as food.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously the thing, is working as a plant taxonomist and doing rare species inventories, ecological inventories where you're just interested in who's present. You're not necessarily looking for rare plants in those cases. I've worked throughout most of the state of Maine and over a lot of New England for that matter. And so I see the plants all the time. But it wasn't until I really got interested in human nutrition and looking into the differences between wild and cultivated plants that it really started to come around to, like, I need to eat these. They're not survival foods.
Right.
Right. The plane crashes, I'm going to go eat this.
Yeah.
No, we need to be ingesting these on a daily basis, if possible, as much as we can. And so for wild rice, of course, wild rice harvesting in Maine, there's just no information. There wasn't, not when I started. There's always rumors of, oh, so-and-so gathered that. But I've never seen any of these people
we
doing
have
anything.
A fairly obliterated ethnographical history here in Maine, right? Compared to as we move west through North America, there's a lot more record keeping about what indigenous peoples were doing on the landscape.
There is rumors that local Maine indigenous harvested wild rice, but harvesting wild rice involves specialized tools, specialized techniques. There's a culture around it.
Yeah.
And there's no evidence.
Even if you came to my house, you would see that. Coming to your house, you see that because the implements are so specialized.
But there's none of that present.
Interesting. But there are plenty of artifacts
for all
many
kinds of other
cultures.
things. That's right.
Okay.
And so there doesn't seem to be any real evidence that this was something harvested in this area.
And there's nothing written.
Yes, and
Wow.
not to mention the fact that some of the water bodies that we harvest on, it has been planted, and it was planted for waterfowl. They were planting a species native to North America, native to the Northeast for that matter, but it was not necessarily found on those water bodies. And this is true of...
So INFW's planting it, or Ducks Unlimited's planting it, or something like that.
And this is similar to, we could talk about many fish where the rainbow smelt is native to Maine, but wasn't necessarily found in this lake or that lake.
Mm-hmm. Man, I know it's not the right attitude, but I'm like, spread it around.
It is so amazing that I can understand. I mean, wild rice, despite the fact that it is native to northeastern North America, it makes a very dramatic change to the ecosystem. It functions like an invasive, right? Yeah. I mean, think of what the cover of wild rice when we go through. It's near 100% cover in some places. And so I'm not proposing that we do or we don't, only that we need to recognize that it's a change, and all changes are good for some organisms and bad for others. And it might mean in some places we do introduce it, and in some places maybe there's rare species, sensitive species, we say no, not here.
But like as a footnote for the listener who throughout this conversation starts thinking, I'm going to plant this in such and such water body near me because I want to harvest it. I mean, you're talking about tremendously upending the ecological balance that is currently in place.
And you need a lot of space.
Yeah.
You've been out on these places, Daniel. We're harvesting over acres and acres of water. It's not that I have a small pond, I'm going to put it in. You'll literally get a cup of rice, you know? So to get back to the part that you were talking about, I had to go find out how to do all this. What I was doing is I was harvesting by hand, literally just using my hands to strip the mature grains that were ready to drop into the water and just collecting them in a bucket. And then I would parch them a little bit, use my hands,
winnow them.
just rubbing between my hands to get rid of what would be called the chaff, the scales that enclose the grain. And I would make a meal or two a year. Nothing big, but it was fun, and I got to eat it, and it was really cool. Do
you remember the first time that you ate a meal of it? I mean, it's pretty mind-blowing, the quality, especially when you've had wild rice as sold in stores or at restaurants,
right.
which is an inferior quality grain. I mean,
it's
much
hybridized.
tougher. It's
it is
hard
sometimes
to chew.
hybridized with the Asian species. It's paddy grown. It's machine harvested, and then it has been processed through repeated wetting and drying to make it hard, because people are valuing the aesthetic of those intact dark
that's
grains.
why it's hard to cook.
Yeah, like it never cooks.
That's why it's hard to
Our
cook.
wild rice.
Because what?
They're doing they're re-wetting it and drying it and re-wetting it and drying it, because it's almost got like a rubbery, like like they say,
yes.
like a carrot needs to get thrown away, or I guess composted, when you can touch the two ends together and the carrot doesn't break, right? That's a bad sign. But when you've cooked wild rice as sold in stores, you can almost
You
do that
practically
with it.
do
It's
that.
quite like rubbery.
But as you guys well know, when you cook actual hand-gathered, hand-processed wild rice, its texture sits between white rice and store-bought wild rice. And it's wonderful. It has a bit...
It's like a brown rice.
Yeah, it
It's
has a
very
bit
soft.
more substance to it, but it's not chewy, especially once you learn how to cook it.
Oh, it's soft.
It's the best.
Flavorful.
Yeah.
Yeah, you must have just been blown away.
Yeah, and so for me, Sam there invited me out to... It was really interesting because I was getting into this harvest, and out of the blue, Sam says, "You should come out and harvest wild rice with me." And I was like, "Oh, great!" So,
Wisconsin.
Yep. So we go out, and Sam there takes me out on the water, and we spend a couple of days harvesting with him. Sam is very particular, call him anal if you want, about the methods, and that's exactly what I wanted. He did polite correcting a lot, which in those 2 days really helped me make sure I could bring that skill back. But so that was the gathering.
It's like, I want to learn, who's the anal guy? I want to learn from him, because I want all the best practices. Yeah, exactly.
And that was Sam. Sam, for people that don't know, just has really good skill sets around wild plants and just criticizing some of the methods that create these inferior dishes made from wild foods. But that was the gathering in bulk, but I still didn't have the processing in bulk. And that I picked up at various Western primitive gatherings like Rabbit Stick and others that are hosted by Backtracks, where I got to speak to individuals, watch what they were doing, step in and try it, and bring that back. And it was really interesting because, as far as I know, there was nobody else doing this. Again, there's always room. Oh, no, so-and-so was doing it, but they weren't showing anybody. I never saw them on the rice beds. I've been on most of them. And I got finally to put together this whole rice
Finally
culture,
get it all together,
if
yeah.
you will, and then started going. And it wasn't that many years before you and I met
Got
and
in
you
on it.
came out.
Yeah, the first thing I ever saw you doing was treading in a hole in the ground with a buckskin liner.
Yeah.
That was like when I first met you. And I would like if you could say a couple words about, because the feeling out here in Maine when we rice is like we are making it up as we go. There's just we're not reliant on or beholden to any traditions. We are using traditional methods from other areas and adapting them here, but we don't have an intact culture that we are beholden to. It's different in the Great Lakes region. So could you just speak to that, so people who first of all, so people who know about that don't think we're glazing over it, and for people who don't know about it to understand that this is a very developed, still intact harvesting style out there.
Hey, I hope you're enjoying this episode of the WildFed Podcast. I'm really excited to announce that our WildFed hats are now available. Your hat's more than just a fashion accessory. It's one of your most important pieces of hunting, fishing, and foraging equipment. Your hat shields your eyes from the sun on the landscape and glare out on the water, improving your visibility and your ability to see what you're searching for. I wasn't really a hat person before I became serious about marksmanship, hunting, and fishing. In fact, I pretty much avoided ball caps altogether. Now I almost never go into the field without one. It's just simply too important of a piece of equipment. Visually scanning the landscape or shooting under high sun without a hat brim is very frustrating. Fishing without a hat is nearly an exercise in futility, but finding a hat you love can be just as frustrating. WildFed's low-profile, trucker-style snapback hats are clean, simple, and classy. The woven label reads, WildFed. Food is all around you. We produced one in the color they call Loden, which is like a muted gray-green, and I chose it because it blends in when I'm out in the field, but it's right at home in urban environments too. And we're also offering a limited release in Hunter Orange. These hats have been very popular, and I think that's because most states and provinces require you to wear at least an orange hat during the firearm season on big game, making it a perfect companion to your hunts or just to keep you and your family safe out on the landscape during the hunting season. Again, these are extremely high quality, structured, trucker-style snapback hats, and you can find them at wild-fed.com. Go over there and have a look. Now, enjoy the second half of the show.
Yeah, I mean, we've patched it together, obviously using indigenous methods from the Great Lakes region, and everything that we do comes from there. All the techniques we use. We might be using a different canoe. Mine's made of a polymer, but we're still both using this kind of a watercraft. And I just thank you to all of the Great Lakes indigenous for what you have given to us, because this has changed my life, literally. I mean, I don't know if this is where you want to go, but I would say maybe one of the biggest differences between there and here is here there's a lot of bickering, might not be the right word, but whose rice is it?
Wait, I want to get to that first. Okay. But before we do, because that's on my list here.
Yeah.
But out west, it's regulated by the states, correct?
Very much so.
Tools
and
are regulated.
You need to have a permit if you are of non-indigenous
It's one
ancestry.
of the few places where the plant harvest is regulated in a way similar to how animals are. There's a legal method of take, right, as well?
There is, and in fact, even they dictate, rightly so, to adhere to tradition, what would the rice knockers, the sticks that we use to lean the rice plants over and strip the ripe grains off into the canoe with, that's to be made from northern white cedar.
You'd be stupid to make it out of something. I want to use ironwood.
Your arms would be so tired by
what's
the end
heavy?
of the day.
I want to use something heavy.
But yes, you're right, Daniel. There are rules and regulations, and it is extremely well studied. Extremely in the Great Lakes region. I mean, the amount of research that has gone into wild rice is pretty crazy. Here,
by universities, by the state,
by their fishing game biologists. Here, we just have people with all kinds of beliefs that believe things that aren't true.
We're gonna get there. But wait, so out here, we have none of those regulations.
Well, we have one now.
Wait. We're gonna get there. We had none of those regulations.
Yeah,
and all that was really being done was some plantings to feed waterfowl. Correct?
Yes.
Okay. Then what happened?
Then a lot more people started getting involved in it. And people who couldn't necessarily speak to what this practice is about, how it actually is part of reciprocal conservation, how it sustains rice, that humans collecting the grains benefits the plants. Mm-hmm. And it's that, and I'm just going to call it that, it's the colonizer attitude. I just moved here, I want in. Mm-hmm. Right? You'll see lots of people who are involved in the social justice movement who are very much recognize that there's something different between the indigenous of this continent and the people who have moved here. And it's a long history of habitation. It's a long history of interacting with resources. It's having your ancestors buried in the ground. Like their DNA is literally in the ground.
In the plants.
Right?
Yeah.
But that only counts for them. Let's say you've lived here 6, 8, 10 generations, and your ancestors are buried in the ground. If you're white, it does not matter. There's this massive disconnect that happens. And I've moved here, and I've been here a year, and I'm going to start my own rewilding movement. You just got here. You don't even know the atmosphere. or I want to start gathering this plant too. I don't have to apprentice with somebody and learn the ins and outs, learn who's been harvesting from where. Nope, I'm going for it. It's this just blaze ahead, you're white, you have no privileges, no rights kind of thing. And so that's what we've seen. Every single person harvesting in Maine that I know of is essentially connected to me. I either taught them how to rice, or taught somebody who taught them how to rice, or I showed them where to go get it. And you can tell that the frustration is in my voice, and yet people are still just happy to take it away from me.
I want to say that in my experience, boy, the last several years of my life, I just got knocked for a loop. I do a lot of stupid things. One of them is what I'm doing right now, which is trying to bring together the worlds of people who hunt, fish, and forage under kind of a banner. And boy, is that going to be an interesting thing to observe. But I did it also in my last podcast and project, Rewild Yourself. I didn't understand, because a lot of the people who were following along with that were involved heavily in the so-called primitive skills world. And it took me a little while to get a good lay of the land of what that scene is like. And it's a very rich, diverse, and complex world. But one of the things that I've noticed is that there's a contingent there of folks who have the, I want to say dumpster diving, but maybe it's more appropriate to say like political anarchist background. And the dumpster diving just comes out of that. Those folks seem to have filtered very rapidly. They're like the early adopters in this. I'm not talking about the primitive skills world, but I'm talking about that anarchist contingent of it. They tend to be early adopters of the social justice mentality. And those folks seem to be running around pointing the finger at everybody, telling us what we can and can't do. And they are now that community of folks out here seems to be very active in saying that we shouldn't be ricing because we're not indigenous. Can you speak to that piece of it? Because that's the part that I find the most frustrating is like, I've been doing it a while. No one else is doing it. I'm actually eating this food, and you're dumpster diving in Portland telling me I shouldn't be able to do this.
I have never once seen a single person ricing on any ricing bed in the state that I've gone that wasn't someone that I taught how to rice.
Right. And as you were saying, it's not as if we have an intact indigenous tradition here.
Well, can we even break this down more? What we do see now is we're ricing in the Androscoggin and Kennebec River drainages primarily. The indigenous population in those river drainages was essentially annihilated, driven off their land. Many fled to Quebec, Odanak, St. Francis area. I don't agree with this having happened. I wish it had not happened. I wish we had those elders present here today. As I understand, there are a few individuals that live here and there, but we lack that intact First Nations culture that could be sharing with us. This is how we have gathered and honored the rice for generations, long before your ancestors came here. I wish that was present.
As it is in the Midwest.
But what we see are people from other river drainages. And remember, in Maine, the river drainages were kind of defined the geography of which groups were where. We see people who historically never were present in these river drainages now kind of claiming, oh, this is our territory. No, it never was.
Yeah, it's
it was the territory of a people who have been driven away. And without them, you get to kind of adopt it as this is our ancestral homeland, but it never was.
Right. Oh, it's complicated.
It is.
Are they ricing anyway? I mean, that would be...
No. And the thing is you see this happening where, a group took out some indigenous of Maine, and suddenly there's an article in the paper about, returning people to this resource that they never harvested. Right. And I've done that too. I've taken Native Americans ricing. We just treated it as we took friends ricing.
Yeah,
We
right.
didn't turn it into a social justice
Yeah.
event. We didn't put it in the paper. We
Thank
didn't
you.
virtue signal and say, this is what I did. I took people ricing, and those same people have come here to learn how to process, and I have a great relationship with these gentlemen who are Passamaquoddy. Love these guys. They're so down to earth, and I'll continue to go with them. But there's never going to be some big article, look what I did.
The rule that you mentioned earlier, so kind of catch us up to speed. It's so funny to try to have this conversation because it's very emotionally loaded for both of us, right? It's like,
Yeah.
I'm triggered.
Well, there was
I'm triggered.
Yeah, there was a person who was stopped by a Maine game warden who had been harvesting wild rice and essentially was questioning the individual. And the individual, as I understand, was not able, because I mean, it can be very intimidating, and I understand that, but they were not able to wage a sort of a productive argument about what they were doing, how this does not harm the resource, and so on. And as a result, the warden took that information back, and ricing became banned on all state-owned wildlife management areas. So these places where rice has been specifically planted for waterfowl like wood ducks and other species that we see using these marshes a lot. And that's it. They just summarily banned it. Now, what was interesting is they banned it on the grounds that because wild rice is an annual species, it needs all those grains to be able to, essentially restock the next year, which turns out actually not to be the case.
It's like, wow, what a deep understanding of botany.
There's a lot of things wrong with that I won't go into. But at the same time, they never brought in the users of the resource, the wild rice, to ask them. And they never brought in someone with expertise, an actual botanist who could talk to them about the biology of wild rice and help them understand how harvesting in a particular way actually benefits and spreads the grain.
Let's say we're surely spreading these colonies.
Yeah.
Grant and I have had the opportunity this year to interview quite a few people in the fisheries, and it's very obvious that the way the fisheries are going is to a new type of management over time that involves the fishery biologists, but also involves the people who fish and then the communities where they fish. And they're certainly looking to break up the state into much smaller areas where, much smaller management zones that are informed, that decisions are informed by the people who fish there as well as the scientific finding. What just happened sounds a lot more like the older model, which is based on bad science with no input from the users.
Right. And no input from people, again, with any expertise in the biology, because the things that were stated just turn out not to be true. Just to give one example, whenever we harvest rice, when we're in the marsh poling the canoe through, we're looking at 4 to 5 years of seed production that have come up, because wild rice has germination inhibitors so that it doesn't just all sprout the next year. It waits in case there's severe flooding or intense herbivory from wild geese, Canada geese and things like that. So it staggers its production. And to believe that you could harvest in 1 year and damage the rice bed is just not understanding the biology of wild rice.
Not to mention, one of the things we've talked a lot about is that every time the person knocking rice, so that person who's sitting, every time they're knocking rice in the boat, grains are falling over the edge, and they're
swiping,
casting them
that's
out
right.
laterally.
We're spreading them further than they would go by gravity and wind alone.
Yep. In other words,
we're part of the distribution. We're part of spreading this plant around in its populations.
A great example of the reciprocal nature of what you were talking about, in that the plant is benefiting by us spreading it, and the plant's production of seed takes into account herbivory, which
it's so interesting to think that we know that wild rice has been harvested for at least 2,000 years in the Great Lakes region, and it's still there.
Yeah, exactly.
So we're claiming that traditional methods can damage the rice beds.
Yeah.
I mean, it's ludicrous when you look at the information available to us.
I guess just to wrap that up then, how would you like to see it go from here? Because we're in this awkward position now where at this point, now I feel like I've been joking about, harvesting my wild rice under night vision now, just so that I don't have to deal with anybody giving me a hard time about it. I would much rather talk to a warden out there than talk to a social justice warrior out there. I tell you that. I mean, that would be, I feel like I could speak the language with wardens very easily, but when it comes to somebody who's just like blaming me for cultural things that happened in the past that I was not a part of and my Italian ancestors were not a part of, is like frustrating to me. So now moving forward, it's like, I'm like, is this spot okay? Is it not okay? Are we going to get in trouble? Are we not going to get in trouble? Is this legal? Is it not legal? How would you like to see this unfold? It's so clear when we go fishing what the rules are. We don't always like the rules or agree with them, but it's clear, right? There's a book every year and it tells us what to do.
If we had a community of people where the young people who have recently moved to Maine actually could respect the people they learned from, but it's tough because in this case, it's a white male, myself. So I will never get that respect that, say, an indigenous
from this particular demographic of
group.
people.
That's right.
Obviously, a lot of people don't see it that way and are colorblind and they don't care.
But within this particular group, it's very clear that is the case. And so at some point, we need to get everybody together and we need to actually bring up some of these topics that we've been discussing and find ways to say, look, this water body has been harvested for over a decade by these people. Why don't we leave it to them and the people they bring? And you've been harvesting from here. You keep that. And we might even have ways of marking areas that we're harvesting within. Indigenous did this by bundling rice together to outline an area where they would harvest within. We also have to talk to the biologists to get them to better understand how their policy right now is based on a very poor understanding of wild rice. And then the people who are moving to the state really need to have an understanding that most of the rice is being harvested right now, and just because you moved here doesn't give you a right to it. You need to become friends and essentially build a relationship with both the people and the rice before you just start harvesting.
It's so different because, again, with wildlife, it's so different. You can come to the state of Maine as a non-resident, buy a hunting license, and you now have access to the game that's in trust. Same as everybody else. You may have issues getting access to some land, but mostly in Maine, it's very easy.
Yes.
So that would be different.
But if we don't do these things, which is kind of more of a community approach, we're going to end up with it being regulated. And then the people who have shown everyone how to harvest
get no rice.
It could potentially, and that just seems so incredibly wrong. It's a fundamental disrespect.
I feel like, too, for some people listening to this, it's going to be like, wait a second, wild rice has become a gender and racial issue. And I know that probably makes no sense at some level, but at the same time, I know most people listening have been aware the last couple of years where we hear the headlines, see how things are, and understand, kind of can put this together, what we're talking about. I will say, though, that wild rice as a food and the practice, man, it's one of the most powerful practices in my year. It's just, wow, the going out on the boat, working together as a team, filling the boat with food in a way that there's just no other plant food that I harvest. I mean, when we go out and harvest leeks, we fill big baskets, or I go out for acorns, I fill big baskets, but nothing like a boatload like this. This is literally a boatload. And then, bring it back and dry it. And then all of the steps that go until you have finished rice. And we just kind of finished up quite a big, not all of our rice. We still have several bags that need to be processed, but we did a big whack of it, and now have all these like lined up nice 500 ml jars of rice ready to eat. And I get two things. Like Grant's girlfriend said to me famously,
A lot of work for some rice.
A lot of work for some rice. I've heard that from a couple people now. And then she bought me that package of Uncle Ben's wild rice mix, you know? So it's got like, it's mostly white rice with a little flecks in it. She's like, 99 cents. Like, it's pretty, I don't know why you're doing it. And she's teasing me, obviously, right?
Understood, yeah.
But then Lawrence, who I bear hunt with and have done some traveling with, you know, a guy who's dedicated his life to hunting and fishing, same thing, just, geez, Dan, seems like a lot of work to get a little bit of rice, ain't it? So he says to me. And it's like, well,
but it's not. It's a lot of rice.
Yeah, it's exactly. It's a lot of rice.
And I get more food from this than when I go hunting for big game.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? Calorically, it's incredible.
Yeah.
And then as far as like a day of recreating too, you know, I mean, it doesn't get any better.
Because you can't go in inclement weather, so we're often out there. First weeks of September, sun is shining. You're getting all that reflection off the water. If you were losing your tan, it's coming back. And we're swimming because it's in shallow water, so we're diving in at the end of the day. We've been watching osprey, great blue heron, wood duck, snapping turtles, and all this wildlife all day long. Yeah, there's nothing better.
It's amazing. And then there's all of the funny parts too. Like we were in that first aid class the other day, and Avani's like pulls a rice grain out of her bra. It's just like, where'd that come from? It's like
I find
embedded
it years
into your
later
body.
in places.
It just gets into everything. But it's such a nice practice. Yeah, I really. And then it's like makes me a little. You know, here we are telling untold numbers of people about it. Which is stupid.
Yes, but we're telling you about
There's a lot of processing, though.
The point is to be respectful and start by buying it.
Yeah.
Start by buying it from First Nations people who are hand harvest it and sell it to raise money for their communities.
That's a great point because
you can be involved in eating wild rice. Just don't immediately run out and start harvesting.
Yeah, I better
Build
not
a
catch you on
relationship.
my rice. Yeah, but that's a good point is that you can buy actual wild rice, not the paddy grown stuff,
That's
but
right.
rice harvested by First Nations people in the Great Lakes region who then sell their rice into some kind of conglomerate which you can purchase from.
So you're getting a nutrient-dense wild food and you're supporting a traditional harvest. And obviously the money is filtering back into those communities who desperately need it.
Wow, wild rice. Good stuff. That was a nice meal you guys cooked for us.
Yeah, I don't leave any, when I go to dinner or lunch at one of your houses now, I don't leave any rice on the
don't
plate.
leave the grain.
Yeah, it's like when you're eating white rice and there's some stuck to the side, you're just like,
Yeah,
whatever.
just leave it. Or, you know, when you go to this, you know, if you go to like, let's say you go to like a Thai place or something and you get a curry and they give you.
They're just handing it out as this like
it's like scoops of ice cream on your plate, just massive things of rice of which you can't even possibly eat more than a third of.
Nobody does this with wild rice.
You would it just when I look at it, I imagine to myself how wasteful, like how much white rice goes into compost every year because people can't possibly eat it all. My wife, as you guys know, grew up in Quebec, and so she's been heavily immersed in French food culture, and we're so different in this way. She finishes a plate. And there's scattered little bits of everything she's eaten on the plate, which she just never finishes. I just don't get it because I use this whole edge of my thumb here as like a type of, I don't know, like a rubber spatula type thing. And I
squeegee.
scrape squeegee. And I eat, my plates look almost like they've come out of the dishwasher or something when I'm finished. She doesn't do that, except now that she processes the wild rice, she doesn't leave grains of rice around. Because like, there's a joke I had made the night that we did the episode 6 dinner, where I kind of said, "Hey guys, just so you know, like every grain of rice you've eaten tonight was actually she handled each one at some point." You know, that's really stuck for her, and so there's not a lot of rice left on the plate. I want to talk about our bear hunts, man. I mean, I barely got to talk to you. You and I get to see each other somewhat infrequently, and when we do, it's usually pretty full force. We're doing something,
right?
And then there's not a lot of time to talk about other stuff because we're busy doing what we're doing. And go back a few hangouts ago, and we harvested bears, and I guess I'd just love to get your after action report. And I also. There's 2 parts to that because there's the bear hunt, but also the working with the hounds. And so that's like 2 conversations, and I'd like to piece those apart.
Yeah, as I tried to explain this to the folks who were handling the bear dogs, that bear hunting has always been something that's been harder for me because bears are very hard to encounter. I mean, think of how many deer have you seen in your life? I don't even know what that number is. And when it comes to bear, I have spent a lot of time outdoors. And I've seen approximately 20 bear in my life.
How often have you kicked one up in the woods?
Once every 5 years. They're so wary and they're so quiet. It happens. I've come across a sow with 3 cubs. There's 4 of my 20 bears I've seen in my life. You know what I mean?
I've had that too, and that's 4 of them.
Yeah, and I've had a bear swim across a river and just come out on the beach where I was standing, not realizing I was there. So I've had these great views of them, and bears hold a really special place in my heart. Not to mention, Arthur comes from Arctos, which is bear. My name means bear. But it's hard because do you want to trap? Well, I hate leg hold traps. I like lethal traps. You kill the animal dead, go for it.
Well, yeah, let me just say for people,
please.
In Maine, you can hunt bear in what's called our general season, which is usually what that is somebody's deer hunting. They have a large caliber rifle and a bear comes across. So during deer season, it's general bear season. So that accounts for, I believe, about 8% of bears taken.
I heard 7, but something like that. So very few.
Very few bears taken that way because you very rarely, as you're saying, encounter them. You can trap bears here, typically done with a leg hold.
Right.
You can hunt bears over bait. Which is that you are obviously baiting an area and usually in a tree stand. Of course, you could do it from the ground, but usually you're in a tree stand. And then you can hound as well.
And for me, so the leg hold trap isn't something I'm excited about. I'm not saying that if it was true survival, that changes. You're not bound to any ethics. The wolves aren't worried about, we've kind of bitten that moose a few times. We should probably let this one go. When it is survival, there are no ethics. I don't mean to say that you go out of your way to cause more harm and suffering.
But in nature, many animals get eaten while they're still alive.
But that disappears. But we're not in that right now. So trapping is out for me. Baiting, I've hunted over bait a couple of days. And baiting is also tough for me because we know a lot of things happen. One, a lot of very inappropriate foods are put in our forests, things that are not beneficial to bears or the other animals that come to bait piles.
Donut and fry grease would be
These
are
two
main
great
ones,
examples, but even jelly beans and candy and things.
And actually, was it New Hampshire I believe it was New Hampshire that finally banned chocolate because they were finding so much dental decay in bears.
And we have to remember that when you bait animals, you bring animals that may be spread out on a landscape in together in close proximity. And we know what happens when you do that to humans. Disease transmission picks up. And we're not talking about just between bears, but potentially between species because lots of things visit these piles. Now, that said, if we were baiting with a carcass, whether we had a roadkill deer, a farmer has a cow die that they can't butcher, all for it because I put worms on hooks. I'm not against baiting. I'm against baiting with things that cause harm, right? So if you were doing carcasses, if you were doing something that mimicked natural food like nuts, a lot of my reservations drop. I still feel like it's not my talent anymore. We're bringing them in. And then there's with hounds where we're relying on the dogs. And that I'd always had reservations about as well. And partly because it's not me. I'm just waiting for the dogs to do their work and then I get to shoot the bear. But watching the people handle the dogs and their understanding of how they could even predict what animal the dogs were chasing based on the way the dogs were moving was just amazing. And it's treed now. And it was really interesting to watch. Knowing that humans and dogs have a long history of cooperation, this cooperative partnership, that has become less off-putting to me, if you will. I still wish that it was possible to just do it routinely through like we do with deer. We track, we scout, we set up, we ambush, we take our shot. But frankly, with bear, that's really difficult.
Here.
Yeah, here.
Yeah, because, when I watch shows like Steve Rinella's show, Meat Eater, and you see him go to Alaska, and, the strategy of like, well, we just hike up to the blueberries, glass the area till we locate 3-4 bears, pick one, go after it. It's like, that is awesome to me. We just don't have that here. And I don't want to fly to Alaska to fly bears home with me. I want to hunt our bears here.
Exactly.
And that methodology doesn't work under our canopy.
They are perhaps one of the most difficult things to hunt here, which is where the dogs can potentially make or break the ability to put bear to actually have this interaction with the bear and to be able to consume this super nutrient dense food.
Sometimes, you like think about if some event in history had changed how dramatically, the world would look, how different the world would look now, like how dramatically different. One thing I've been thinking about lately is, what was that nut that Samara gave me today? It was like a hazelnut?
Yeah, hazelnut, yeah.
Okay, so, I cracked that hazelnut. At first I thought she had acorns on the plate just out of the corner of my eye.
They kind of looked same color.
Same size, right? Yeah. So I crack one and it's a nut that I can put right into my mouth and it tastes delicious. I was just thinking the other day about if acorns were like that, how different the world would be. I mean,
oh my God.
the amount, the degree to which acorns have been consumed by pre-industrial people around the world,
as it is,
and I don't just mean indigenous people, because also.
Oh no, it's still going.
Yeah, right. Acorns have been an important survival food in times of famine and all that. So if you could just eat acorns, how many crops would never have needed to have been developed?
Yeah.
Right. Imagine it'd be like if cashews just fell out of our oak trees, you know what I mean? It just, right. So the world would be really different. Well, if human beings and dogs never work together, like if we didn't develop this, now a lot of bad stuff's come out of this, but let's put that aside for now. I just want to say, if humans and dogs we would not be sitting here like this. I mean, the relationship of humans and dogs is not some modern convenience, nor is it like something like where we were the dominant creature on the landscape and we then said, hey, let's go domesticate these wolves.
Not when it happened.
We are partially who we are because of the interface that we have with dogs. So to me, hounding went from this thing of, I guess, I don't even know that these were necessarily my ideas, but I thought they were my ideas. But now I see that there's been many years of an anti-hunting sentiment in media that led me to this to some degree too. But I thought it was unfair. I thought it was cruel. I thought it was shameful. I just had all these feelings about it. And like a lot of people, I thought like it should be me in the woods pitted against my wits and the skill and the animal and all that.
That's what you're hearing me say now.
But it's like hunting with dogs is very, very ancient. And the idea that all that's left of dogs becomes like lap dogs over time, like to me, I think it's important that hunting with dogs
it's like all that's left of humans are
the equivalent is the people at like Planet Fitness. Like, no, that's not okay with me. So I don't know why, but when I think of lap dogs and the equivalents in humans, Planet Fitness pops in my mind. Maybe because it's a no judgment zone. But anyway, I like the idea of hunting with dogs now. So much so that I have one of these dogs now. Right. My dog has become much more of like a roll over and rub my belly type of dog as of late. But I've really fallen in love with the idea of hunting with dogs, even though it was somewhat detestable to me in the beginning. So.
And the same. And yeah, there's a bunch of reasons for that. And part of that is I think that we went out with the exact right people. You were able to introduce me to a couple of gentlemen from Wisconsin who weren't, and I don't know what words to use here, so I'm just going to let it come out. They just weren't douchebag hunters that just wanted to kill bears.
There's a lot of those too. I mean, that's
these guys had a deep appreciation for bears. Mm-hmm. You could tell that it was something that they loved doing, they loved seeing, they loved their dogs. They had an excitement and enthusiasm around everything to do with bear.
They also didn't show up here with like 15 ATVs and winches and go like.
No, these dudes are on foot.
They were going to cut these bears and carry them out,
which they helped us do,
which is awesome because a lot of guys, it's a lot of bears are getting left in the woods, or they'll take the hide and skull, but the meat gets left.
And like I said to you, Daniel, I was coming off backpacking for rare plant survey work in Baxter State Park, where Katahdin, our highest mountain, is. Sarah, my wife, and I were up and down this mountain, and I was barely keeping up with this guy.
Yeah, these guys are moving.
You remember?
Yeah. And I couldn't keep up with you guys.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that was.
And so all of that just made me realize that it's not that I'm like, well, let me put this another way, that with the right bear hounders, I can fit in so long as I'm seeing that appreciation for the animal coming, and they gave that.
Because the world of houndsmen, bear hunting, houndsmen, having gone to some of the epicenters of that, at least on the East Coast,
yes.
I have got to go down to Tennessee and North Carolina and see a lot of that world, and a lot of it is pretty unsavory, and it's just a lot of what you'd picture. You know what I'm saying? It's like all those things. It's like the Confederate flag out the truck window, a beer can flying out the side.
It's what kept me away.
Dogs having like brands, fried onto the side of them, all that stuff. But that's not every. And and Lawrence told me about those guys. He said, Dan, I'll tell you what, I'm almost done my hunting career, but yours is just getting started. And I'm gonna make sure you get hooked up with the right people, because there's some good folks and there's some bad folks. And and he really felt these were good people. And so, I agree that was a big part of it, is who we were with and their methodology. At the same time, those guys like killing bears, though.
No, fair.
They
totally
definitely want to rack them up,
But I also, part of the thing that I also knew was going on is that I knew someone was going to shoot a bear that day.
Yep.
And we just made the decision. We talked here, me and my wife, briefly. Look, somebody is going to shoot that bear, and it can be us, and we can offer gratitude and try to bring that deep respect for the animal in the ways that we know how to do, or somebody else can do it. And we decided, no, this made sense for us to go. That was the first large animal I ever shot with a high-powered rifle.
Oh, it was?
That's the first one.
Yeah, you when you do rifle shoot, you shoot a pretty small caliber gun.
Yeah, but I'd never shot anything, deer or bear, until this year.
Oh, okay. Everything was archery before?
Yeah, different stuff. And so that you were there for not only the first bear that I ever killed.
Oh, no kidding.
But the first large animal I shot with a high-powered rifle.
That moment when you shot the bear, pretty powerful.
Yeah.
Moment, right? It's like,
yeah, I mean, you're seeing this amazing animal up close. You know that not only is the animal extremely beautiful, in my opinion, but it's also an extremely dangerous animal. We're in close quarters, but obviously things are skewed toward me with this weapon.
A significant advantage,
right? And so I understand that, and it was just this juxtaposition of all of these different emotions coming together. That's hard to articulate here.
And it's got, obviously it's a stretch to say they're anthropomorphic, but they certainly are, compared to a lot of the, well, I guess they're quadrupeds, but I guess to the ungulates that we're used to thinking of as food animals, they are much more akin to what we are. Right?
And that's not just with us. That's in local Wabanaki legend and so on, that these are considered to be, sometimes our parents, or we're also considered to be a human, very much so.
When you see them in the tree, it reminds me a bit of seeing a big chaga, because when you come upon a big chaga, they're so richly black.
Yes.
And nothing else in the landscape is like that except shadows. So when you actually see one and you realize, oh, that's not a shadow, you get up to the chaga, it's starkly contrasted. And when you see a black bear like that in a tree, at least in that dark black color phase, it feels like that to me, in that, how is this animal so well hidden all the time, and yet it really does stand out like a silhouette against its landscape? In the tree, you see it from that distance. This big black blob up there. What did you think about once we started cutting? Because we were a couple miles back with your bear. And
it was a
pretty
long way
pretty
in.
rough terrain too.
We were in small mountains essentially, and there was no dragging this animal out. I mean, we'd have been
no way. I mean,
it's just too much. So we had to butcher the animal, quarter it up in the field, and bring it out. And that was you, me, and Ryan.
Yeah.
The three of us carried this heavy bear. I mean, I had about 60 pounds in my pack. But it was crazy because these were animals that were doing really well. The volume of fat, it was so much more than I had even seen with the few bear I've seen. I was getting lost.
That's the thing about it, right? It's like game of Operation gone bad. It's like, what am I looking at? You know?
And I've butchered so many animals in my life. And I was happy that there were people there that had butchered bear before to be, okay, this usually happens and do. It was just insane.
You're elbow deep in grease too, right? All the knives are slippery, everything. You know, I use contractor garbage bags to pack out bear meat. And a lot of people have said to me, why don't you get game bags? Those fabric game bags. And it's like, well, because of the oil, like
never clean them.
The oil is insane, and it's melting on your back.
Yeah.
Like, this stuff is. I think people don't always realize, like,
this is like the consistency of lard.
Yeah.
So it's like absorbing.
Once in the animals, like when you grab your own subcutaneous body fat, it's like jelly. But when you're dead and cold, and you're no longer, our normal body temp, that goes into something more solid like lard. Yeah. But then once you start handling it again, it's like butter.
Yeah.
And there's big sheets of it.
We spent an
melting.
entire day trimming out and rendering fat from this animal, which has been awesome.
How's that been, having that fat in the house?
It's been great because having a large source of wild animal fat for cooking has been something that's hard to come by. I mean, we do sometimes cook in deer tallow, but that's pretty strongly flavored.
I was going to say, it's just
we
and
do.
The texture too.
Yeah. But you've had a couple of foods that, like when we did the fry bread in the clay pot.
Yeah.
But we had to have the temperature right so it wouldn't absorb too much of it, or it became very strongly flavored. But the bear fat's mild.
Very mild.
Yeah.
In fact, really no flavor. I mean, I'm always amazed.
It's the closest thing to lard that I've ever tasted that wasn't lard. Yeah. And so other fats that we're using, butter, ghee, will render goose fat and so on and so forth. But the bear fat's been amazing. And it was worth
the quantity, right? It's like the amount of geese we'd need to get some kind of equivalency of fat.
Yeah.
Because one bear. And then I've been in a lucky position the last couple of years in that these guys bring me all kinds of extra. And in fact, I still, depending on where you guys are at this year, I still have quite a bit in the freezer I haven't even rendered yet.
Oh, nice.
And I've made more than I'm going to need for the year. The last couple of years, I cut it really close. Like I'd be running out of fat just as I'm finally at that place now where there's no running out. But that fat has so many applications outside. I don't know if you've used it on wood or leather or anything like that yet.
Mostly as just test projects to see how it would go. I mean, obviously, we cooked some of the bear that we had shot together in New Hampshire for this last meal, and that was in a Dutch oven at low heat.
That meal we just ate.
Yeah,
it was fantastic.
And that was overnight, and it was just falling apart. I lifted the femur
it slipped right out.
And it just all the muscle meat came out, and just couldn't be more appreciative of the animal, the people that made that possible. I mean, there's just high quality meat. And you just hear so much about bear meat. Oh, it's too greasy, it's too strong, it's got trichinosis, all of these things. And most of it is untrue. Trichinosis is different. But what I'm getting at is if you prepare it properly, there's none of these strong flavors.
It's delicious.
I mean, if I went out and had the best steak that you could give me and I just black and charred it on the grill, you'd hate it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
It's like you can mess anything up.
Yes, it's true.
And anyways, it was just so wonderful because, Maine's moose, we have a permit system. You have like a 1 in 90 something chance of being selected in a given year. And it's hard.
And how many times in a lifetime? What's the most, you've heard of somebody pulling tags in a lifetime?
Well, if they were allowed to be the sub-permittee and they gave it like a couple of times kind of thing. And the thing is, though, is now, because one deer isn't like what people think, like you put it in the freezer and they're like, oh, you're set for the winter. It's like, no, we're set for like 3 weeks.
I was going to say, we'll eat through a deer. I mean, because I take so many road kills a year that we probably are eating. When I was going down to North Carolina getting a couple of years, it's no problem to eat 6-7 deer in a year.
Easily. And I don't think people realize this, that you don't eat. Granted, very grateful for deer again, but you don't get as much as you think. We'd have to put 3 or 4 in the freezer anyways so that we could have a deer meal once or maybe twice a week throughout the year. It'd take a bunch, and you don't get to have that.
Especially if you do something like what we did recently and eat a whole deer ham as a group of people. Like
yes,
we ate 2. That was 2 deer hams. So we ate half a deer the other day. How many people were we? We had Will cooking. So now we're talking about, this is prelude to episode 7. So you were there, my wife's there, you're there, your wife, Samara was there, Will was there, neighbor Will was there. So we're 7 people,
and we just ate
half a deer in an hour.
Yeah.
So I mean, what would
we
be
could have
left?
kept eating
if we had a small deer, but still.
Yeah.
True, it was a small deer, but the point is illustrative that if you wanted to take a deer and grind and stake out the whole thing, you can make a lot of small meals out of it. But if you decide like, okay, we're going to eat a roast tonight, well, that's a quarter of a deer. So,
yeah.
But the thing that's cool that the bear offers is now you've just doubled, or because bear can be so big, most people I don't think realize that bear can be much larger than deer in terms of weight. I mean, you can get a 400, 500, 600 pound bear. You're getting lucky, but deer don't ever get that big.
Yeah, right. 600 pound deer.
Could you imagine? It's actually scary to be in the forest.
No, right.
But if you have a decent sized bear and a deer that you've acquired, now you're talking about your winter has a lot of meat. In lieu of being able to shoot 1 or more moose like what would have been historically possible here.
Yeah.
And so legally, for people that don't know, we can take a single deer by some method over most of Maine.
An unusual state in that because
right.
I mean, I write about it and routinely get people who are like, wait, what? One deer? I can take 6 a day.
We have an expanded zone where archery can take more deer, and there are some cases where nuisance deer, we can get tags for those and so on. But for the most part, most of the state is a single deer, that's it. And if you're looking for a wild meat to put in the freezer, the bear is what you need to sort of top that off.
Bear often gets compared to a cross between pork and beef, and I think there's a couple things going on there. One, that's pretty accurate.
It's not
2,
bad.
we don't have a huge palette of meats to draw upon in culture in which to compare. But
Right.
the reason I say it is because deer meat to me has, despite people talking about, gaminess in meat, most of the deer that I eat to me are like the principal mild red meat. There's just so
I'm just chuckling.
It's just so light and just so clean. Beef, by contrast, has a strong cow flavor. It has it's not like a barnyard smell, but it's like it's the musk of cow in it.
Look, Samara, who's my daughter, because she has multiple homes, multiple experiences that she deals with, her palate is definitely trending toward that mild flavored side. And deer and bear are both consumed without compunction here.
I would say that bear has a flavor. Deer to me does not have a flavor. Like if you're like, is this deer, moose, elk? It's like those cervids just have such a mildness. Whereas like sheep has a flavor too, right? It's like a strong, distinct flavor.
Like a lamb.
I like it, but it's a strong flavor.
At this point now, this is I guess my 3rd year of bear hunting. And I've eaten 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bears. There's just a bear taste that I can pick up. And that but no stronger than what cow has. I just can think of it. So in that way, I think it's a lot like beef. I can detect it, I meant. But then it has the fattiness of a pig. Like when we butchered those heritage pigs you raised, the closest experience I've had to bears is those pigs that we butchered. So you have the fattiness of a pig, but the like red meat of a cow.
I mean, these are an absolute gift from our landscape.
Yeah,
I don't
really
know
lucky.
how else to describe black bear. And much like you said, this idea of flying to Alaska to do this, grizzly hunt, I don't think about that. I literally just want to hunt black bear. And what's great for me is knowing that the folks that we have gone out with are very happy for us to use bows. And so next year,
That's
the plan.
Yeah, I like it. I like it. Hopefully we get a bear because
it requires the right conditions depending on where it's sitting.
But what we could do is go out, if we go out together, because I'll use my rifle. I'm going to use my rifle. So but if the bear's high up and you can't get at it, I'll take that one. You take the one that's low.
Because not to mention, just so that I get to put this out there and offering gratitude, Daniel, obviously was helping with just all kinds of things with the butchering, holding this while we're cutting here, tearing this, carrying out. Like now I want to repay that because that was a long way in.
3 miles, I think.
In and out. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
It was
all the West Coast hunters are listening to us. They're just like pansy asses. Like, what do you 3 miles? They're like, I did 15 miles to get my sheep or whatever. But, in the East, that's not typical for people to do.
Right. And not to mention, what we have here is that's not 3 miles of open steppe. No, that's 3 miles of rocky glacier forest.
Yeah, and a lot of that whole like stream bed that we walked. You remember all that moss, and it was just like that gnarly V.
But I wouldn't change it. It was great.
It's beautiful.
When I got done at the end of that day, what felt better about it is how much effort we had to put in. It wasn't like just step off the skid road where the ATV is setting, get into the blind and shoot a bear over bait. I'm not trying to trash on that right now. I'm saying I wouldn't have a great feeling about that. And this, I got done. I was tired.
When we found out the dogs were 3 miles up, you were like, yes, here we go.
we actually have some footage of you saying that, right? Where he's like you go, you're looking at the GPS or something. You're like, oh, I want that.
Yeah.
Like you're talking about the hiking.
Yeah.
Another thing that's cool about it to me is like, here we are today. It's, fresh coat of snow out there. We're deep into winter now. It's ice fishing time. And we just ate wild rice and your bear. That harvest of those two species gives right around till we get back to that time of year again.
Yeah,
and that's
exactly.
just a really beautiful thing. So.
But I have to say, I'm hoping this year that one of us draws our moose permit.
I know.
So
it's going to be me. I'm already feeling it. Well, any kind of final thoughts on any of that? A lot to look for. I'll just say this. There's a lot to look forward to in the rest of the season. So we're talking right now about episode 6. But you joined us for the episode 7 dinner, which is incredible.
Oh, so
and here we
nice.
are shooting episode 8 out in the snow right now, getting some time on the ice and all that. That said, Arthur, just in closing, what kind of things are you doing from a wild food perspective this winter, and what are your focuses?
Obviously, for us this time of year, we're limited, both legally and in just actuality, what we can go after. Deer are out. Seasons on things like rough grouse and gray squirrel have ended.
Closed, yeah.
And so we really focus heavily on ice fishing. We bring in so much wild meat from ice fishing that we're having multiple wild fish meals a week. And it's what stretches the deer and the bear.
Yeah.
We're gathering a few plants. We occasionally go chaga hunting, but we do gather branches of eastern white pine, remove the bark, and just infuse it for a couple of days in cold water. And that's a big part of that fresh phytochemistry and vitamin C coming in this time of year.
And I had that for the first time when I was here last time, and it's so good.
What do you guys call it?
A little maple syrup.
Yeah, it's our Wilder water.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good.
But, those are the things that we focus on because most of the other things like the acorns, the wild rice, and our other staples, we've already gathered them. We process as needed, particularly with the acorns. So we've dried them and stored them in shell. So we're still interacting with the foods.
Yeah.
But in terms of what we're gathering, it's mostly fish and pine.
I really would like to get down to the coast and do some, because I know this is a good time of year for shellfish. And I've been invited to go out lobstering. They're still lobstering. now
yeah,
too, you know. So those are things
Dude,
that are
those
on my
guys
mind.
are hardcore.
But yeah, I know it's primarily
the
the
weather
fishing,
and
yeah.
the wind. I just have such kudos to give the people
Oh, it's
working off the
incredible,
coast
right?
of Maine.
But we'll get back to talk more about ice fishing in a future episode. We've got some fishing coming up this week. Pretty excited about. Anyway, lots coming your way with WildFed, so keep tuning in. Thanks for your time today, Arthur.
Thanks
Thanks for
Arthur.
inviting me.
Thanks for listening to the WildFed Podcast. You can help us grow the show by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review. It ensures better rankings and more advertiser interest, which translates directly into better shows, more awesome guests, and a constant stream of fresh, new content. Have a question you'd like answered on the show, or a hunting, fishing, or foraging trip you'd like to host us on? Email us at info@wild-fed.com. And be sure to visit our website, wild-fed.com, to check out the WildFed video show and store. WildFed. Food is all around you.